Many lawmakers argue President Trump helped fuel the Capitol riot after repeatedly making false claims of election fraud. The president made those baseless claims that there was widespread voter fraud in many of the closely contested states he lost to President-elect Joe Biden. Despite numerous lawsuits, no proof of voter fraud was ever found. But that did not stop some of President Trump's supporters from believing he was cheated out of an election victory. For more, let's bring in Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle is a CBS News political analyst and a New York Times opinion columnist. His article, Stop the Steal, Didn't Start with Trump, dives into the history of the GOP and claims of voter fraud. Jamelle, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. So in your piece, you argue that making accusations of voter fraud is a tactic the Republican Party has used for some time now. Give us an example.
That's right. So after the 2000 election, there were Republican parties in states like New Mexico and Missouri that alleged that there was a voter fraud that was responsible for Al Gore's narrow win in New Mexico and the defeat of John Ashcroft for Senate in Missouri. He lost to a candidate who had passed away several weeks earlier in a plane crash. After the 2004 election, there are claims that voter fraud assisted Democrats. And in the years after the 2004 election, specifically in 2006, there was an effort to investigate groups like Acorn, no longer exists, but at the time was an activist group, a collection of activist groups that did voter registration work. And the claim was that groups like Acorn and Acorn itself were manufacturing votes, were manufacturing false registrations, so on and so forth. And this has been a regular part of our politics for the past 20 years. And so in my piece, I argue that if you accept that these accusations, these claims have been made and generated for 20 years, then you shouldn't think of Trump as someone who kind of made up these things, but really as a president who is repurposing existing claims and existing arguments for his own purpose among voters who are already primed to take them in as truth.
I want to ask you more about Acorn in just a moment, but overall here, what was the what does it appear the goal here was of the GOP in making these continuous claims over the years, as you point out in your piece, of widespread voter fraud?
Well, part of it is just activating one's own voters, right? Drumming up support, making your supporters angry at the other side and also excited to vote for you. Part of it, too, is justification for passing laws to limit expansions of the ballot, to put new restrictions on voting. And you saw this especially after the Supreme Court's ruling in 2013 in Shelby County v. Holder, which slashed the part of the Voting Rights Act which required states under its purview to clear their election changes with the Department of Justice. And after Shelby County v. Holder, you saw Republican lawmakers in states across the country, not just in the South, pass these draconian voter restriction laws, strict ID requirements, cuts to early voting, cuts to weekend voting, cuts to registration drives, voter purges. And each time the explanation, the justification is that this is needed to combat fraud. Again, and as you said earlier in the segment, fraud is not a real thing. There's very little evidence of it. There's little evidence of it in the past election. And researchers looking at the past 20 years of elections have found that the incidence of fraud is so infinitesimal that it might as well not exist.
Right. And as we point out, in the adjudication of these fraud claims just in this last election, no fraud or evidence of widespread fraud was ever presented to the point that these cases actually advanced. So you mentioned John Ashcroft, Jamelle. So in 2001, then Attorney General John Ashcroft said that the Justice Department would crack down on voter fraud. This is what he said, quote, "Votes have been bought, voters intimidated, and ballot boxes stuffed. The polling process has been disrupted or not completed. Voters have been duped into signing absentee ballots, believing they were applications for public relief, and the residents of cemeteries have infamously shown up at the polls on Election Day." So it's interesting to hear sort of echoes of this in what the rhetoric has been just in this last cycle. But did John Ashcroft and the Justice Department, Jamelle, ever find any evidence of widespread voter fraud?
So the Justice Department in this period, about 2002 to 2006, opened up many investigations of purported fraud, of alleged fraud, and came away with vanishingly few prosecutions. And the things they did prosecute were pretty much mistakes. Voters casting a ballot in the wrong precinct, voters forgetting to change their registration and then going to vote somewhere else. Nothing like a grand conspiracy of fraud that could shift even a local election, much less a statewide or national election. So there wasn't very much of anything there. It is worth noting that the then advisor to the president, Karl Rove, in 2006, I believe, pressured the Department of Justice and at the time Attorney General Alberto Gonzales to open up more cases, to prosecute more claims of voter fraud. And the resulting actions from this, which involved firing several U.S. attorneys, ended up becoming a major scandal for the Bush administration that ended in Attorney General Gonzalez's resignation from his post.
Jamelle, you mentioned this organization, Acorn. So this was a group that was singled out by the Justice Department's voter fraud investigation. Can you explain what that organization actually did and why it became a target?
So it was an old organization, had quite a bit of history behind it, and they did a number of things. All of them focused on its primary constituency, which was low-income Americans. It organized for affordable housing and housing justice. It organized for standing up against banks, for getting bank loans for low-income families to purchase homes, and it registered voters by the hundreds of thousands. It was in 2000, 2004. In 2008, it ran major voter registration drives. Now, this was not a perfect organization. It had some trouble, especially in the latter part of the 2000s. But its voter registration drives were pretty on the level. There was no evidence of any attempted defraud or manufacture registrations for the purpose of fraudulent votes. And for a number of reasons, I think one of them because it was an effective voter registration organization, one of them because it was effective at challenging the financial industry in particular and the banking industry on issues like redlining. For a bunch of reasons, it became a target of of conservative media, of conservative voices, and of Republican politicians who saw it as much in the same way as unions, as a partisan threat more than anything else, and that was assisting Democrats in helping to win races. And that sort of became the energy behind this extreme scrutiny of Acorn, which reached a crescendo in the 2008 election when John McCain, the Republican candidate for president, nominee for president, accused Acorn of orchestrating a vast voter fraud conspiracy in support of Barack Obama.
And we should point out, as you say in your piece, that in fact Democrats were part of what led to Acorn getting stripped of its funding because of the incendiary sort of nature of some of these accusations against Acorn. Well, finally, Jamelle, we of course all know what happened nearly 2 weeks ago on January 6th after the most recent voter fraud accusations made by President Trump and other Republicans. But what have been some other consequences over the past 20 years or so from these repeated, frequent claims of voter fraud?
Well, I think there are two sets of consequences. The first is among Republican voters. And as we see right now, I don't think you can understand why so many Republican voters believe that the election was stolen without taking account of these voter fraud accusations. The other part of it is simply that voter fraud accusations become fodder for laws that restrict voting and that restrict access to voting. And those laws have spread more or less across the country and have been responsible for what critics say is voter suppression in many states.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this critical time when we have this reckoning going on, it's so important for people to understand why it is that as Americans we cannot even agree on a common set of facts. But your piece gets to at least part of the answer to that question. All right, Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle, great to have you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.